Good morning and welcome to Church 180. We are glad to have you with us this morning. We are continuing in our conversation about what it means to be a Christian, in particular what it means to be a follower of Jesus, a disciple, to use the old language. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. We invite you to get a copy of the Bible or open it up on your device. We're going to be in John's Gospel today. In particular, we're going to be looking at chapters 12 and 13 and maybe 15. Referencing other places in John's Gospel. It's a wonderful gospel to understand who Jesus is and his great love for us. And if you're not familiar with it, we encourage you to read it through and then spend some time really digging in deeply to it. So last time we were together, I asked the question, what is a Christian? And we referenced being a disciple, an old word, and we talked about, well, what is a disciple in current language? And one way of thinking of it, one way in particular that I heard recently and really like is one who follows in order to become like Jesus. One who follows Jesus in order to become like him. There's an emphasis on that, right? It's not just believing in Jesus. It's following Jesus. There's an action to it as well. There's a committing our lives to him. There is a rearranging of everything that's important to us to align with what is important to him. And we find that really described well in various parts of the gospel, but also reflected in the Old Testament, even though Jesus had not yet come, prophesied. And we find it in the letters in the New Testament following the Gospels, where you begin to see the Spirit of God leading Jesus' followers, even after he had resurrected and ascended, leading them in learning and growing as his followers. So again, with that in mind, a disciple, a Christian, as one who follows Jesus to become like him. I want to ask you this morning to remember back when the Lord called you. Now that could be different kinds of calls. So I'm not necessarily looking for a particular one, but just a time in your life when you know that Jesus called you. And I'm wondering if there's anything in particular you remember about that. And I say that because sometimes some of us may have come to the Lord as a child. God may have been working in us through our families or through the church or whatever other means, and we may have come to him as a child, and while that's valid, we may not necessarily remember the specifics of it. Some of us may have come to the Lord later in life, and that calling also being valid, but it may have looked a little different as an adult than it did as a child. Now, I'm not trying to move you in a particular direction. I just wanted to give you a few minutes to think about what it was in your life, what took place, if you remember, when the Lord called you. Anybody willing to share?
Got a busy signal.
Got a busy signal. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Yep.
You got a busy signal. Yeah. Anybody else?
I grew up in church, but at 12 and a half, going through the loss of my biological mother.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the circumstances. I remember going to church and giving my life to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I was 12 and a half, almost 13.
Wow. Yeah, so it was out of a great tragedy, a great sadness, that you turned to the Lord and heard him calling you. Yeah. Anybody else?
I was also kind of raised in church. Every Sunday I went to church. I would sit with my grandmother and look out big church windows at Iowa cornfields. That's how I pictured God. Blue sky and cornfields. And the little church closed. And then we moved to a city, and I didn't like that. I'd stopped going. And then, through a set of circumstances I'm not going to go into, it's a long, involved story, we ended up in a big church. Years later, married, 2 kids. And there was a series of messages in March '85 called Measuring How Much You Matter.
Mm.
And that convinced me, me, not Jim's wife, Ralph and Dorothy's daughter, just me. He died for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, like, it was literally like just,
A great relief, a great excitement.
I don't know how to describe it. It was just a,
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the rest is history.
That's excellent.
Now, granted, I have not followed vigorously
Mm.
the studying and this kind of stuff, but
Sure.
definitely there. Yeah. In fact, this morning, that one song, the second song,
Because he lives.
yes, I got goosebumps.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just reminded you.
Oh, well, it's just a simple statement, but it means so much.
Right. Right.
Okay, I'm done.
When I
That's
was
okay.
about when I was about 12, 12 or 13ish, I had grown up in the church and I had given my life to Jesus to the best of my knowledge as a young boy. And I was about 12. We went through my family had gone through some really hard times that I didn't understand, and was very confused and couldn't quite get my head wrapped around, and just didn't know what the future was going to look like for me and my family. So I remember one night praying and reaching out to God and saying, if you're real, if you really are who you say you are, please help me know that.
Mm.
And I'm not just following what my parents had taught me.
Sure.
And ironically enough, I opened my Bible and read John chapter 13, and verse 7 popped right out at me. And it said, Jesus replied, do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand.
Yeah.
And I claimed that verse.
Mm.
And it worked out, and I understand, and God was true to who he was.
That's beautiful. It's a fascinating verse when you said ironically, and you turned down to that one, because for the Lord to speak to you in that moment and say, you do not realize what I'm doing now, but you will. There's probably an element of that. Matter of fact, I'd be surprised if that element is not present in every single one of our calls, so to speak.
Mhm.
You don't realize, if I can say it a little differently, you don't realize what's going on right now. You think you do. You may have some idea, but boy, will it change as the time goes on. Interesting how it will change. I suspect if we had the opportunity today somehow just magically to go back in time several thousand years and be able to sit with those first disciples and ask them, what was it like when Jesus called you? Wow. We'd probably hear some similar statements. We'd probably hear some,
Ooh,
me? We very likely would hear some, I had no idea what I was being called to. We might hear some, I had an idea, but it certainly turned out differently than what I expected. One thing for sure, each call involves some things that we have all in common, and perhaps individual to our own specific calling and who we are in our relationship with the Lord. I want to talk a little bit about that this morning, and in particular, John's recalling of some of the events that took place. You remember that the Christ in the Greek, or the Messiah, had been predicted for a long time, and we've talked about this before. Israel was certainly expecting a king to come, someone who would come and be a liberator that would rescue them out from underneath the oppression of pagan rulers, and would set them free to be who they understood God wanted them to be in the first place, his special people. We've been reading Exodus in our Wednesday night studies, and we're up to the the Ten Commandments, but one of the things that we've talked a lot about is in chapter 19, particular verses 5 and 6, the Lord makes a point through Moses to the people that I want you to be my treasured possession. Of all the people in the world, and all are mine, I want you to be a treasured possession in order to be, if I can paraphrase, in order to be, for me, a kingdom of priests. And for the whole world, for you to be a holy nation, a nation set apart, a group of people that are set apart to help everybody else understand who I am through the relationship that you and I have, you, Israel, and I have, ancient Israel. And so they were expecting, and they were waiting. And there was a lot of other prophecies in the Old Testament about him coming. And as you remember when he came, well, there was a lot of surprise. He was not at all what they were expecting. One of the things that happened was he ruffled a lot of feathers. There were a lot of people who were not pleased to have him come. Those people being, unfortunately, people in high positions within the Jewish faith. And they really pushed back against him. But God was sending his son in a way that matched what God was trying to do, not what the religious leaders were necessarily wanting. And in light of their unexpected experience with him, he tells us in one of the passages we talked last time we were together, the different passages we remember and which ones maybe really stand out to us. Of course, John 3:16 comes up. That God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. But then right after that, in John 3:17, what does he say? You remember?
God didn't send his son to condemn the world,
Yeah.
but to save the world through him.
But to save the world. He didn't come to condemn, which is an interesting word for us today. Because I think there are a lot of people in our society, in our country, that for whatever reason don't know him as their own personal Savior and Lord, that might look at Jesus as one who is the great judge in the sky. And they might find his people to be instruments of that judgment. You all judge us regularly, right? And a lot of people are turned off by that. But it's good to remember that Jesus himself says, I didn't come for that reason. And John conveys that to us. So then we ask ourselves, well, why did he? Why did he come? If he didn't come to judge, he came to save. He come to save all people? He come to save just a particular group of people? That's opening a can of worms, I know, because different Christians believe differently. Some believe that there's just a set number of people that he came to save, the elect. Others believe that he's come to save anybody who would come to him. And I won't get into that argument today, but I want to point out the fact that Jesus, while he came to the Jews, said in John 10, you remember the passage on the Good Shepherd? He said, but I came to save other sheep too. There are other sheep, not in this sheep pen. That was his way of saying, outside of you all, there's another group of people, and I need to bring them in as well. I need to save them as well. And we believe that that includes what they call the Gentiles, perhaps the Greeks. For you and me, our purposes, everybody other than the Jews. Anybody was welcome.
And the one that I think caused the most uproar, the Romans.
The Romans, that's right. The very oppressive people, the Jews were expecting to be overthrown and kicked out. Jesus came to offer salvation to them as well. So, when you think about Jesus saying that to his people, he must have had in mind that was a coming event. Sooner or later, there would be an opening for all others to also accept him, for all others to come in, anyone who would. And John tells us that at the very beginning of the gospel, you remember? He says that he's come for anyone who would come. And anyone who would believe in him could gain the right to be called his child. So now we get down to chapter 12, and you find Jesus with his disciples encountering a group of people at the Passover festival, an important festival to the Jewish people. Greeks, perhaps Greek Jews, perhaps Jews from other lands, not in Israel, that have come to celebrate. But in any case, Greeks, the scripture says, chapter 12, verse 20. Now there were some Greeks among those who came up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. We would like to see Jesus. And of course, Philip tells Andrew because they were good friends, and then the two of them together go and tell Jesus. Now, I'm sure you've heard teaching on this before. Perhaps you've heard preaching on it as well. But this morning, I want to hold it up to you and just ask, what would be your expected reaction from Jesus? Jesus has said earlier in the gospel, John's recorded just what I said. I have other sheep to welcome, not just these. In other words, I have other people outside the Jewish nation to invite in. And now some of those Greeks are coming and they're saying, we want to see Jesus. How do you think Jesus would have responded?
Sure, bring him in.
Yeah, great, welcome. Come on in. What did he say? Yeah, be a part of the group. And yet what we hear Jesus say is, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. What is he talking about? Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. I would imagine the people listening were probably somewhat familiar and maybe not entirely thrown off because Jesus had been teaching in parables. The other Gospels record them as well. And so they maybe were at the place of thinking, okay, here comes another one of these teachings. We don't necessarily understand where his mind is or why he's telling us these things. But just because this group of people, these outsiders, come and they want to see Jesus, all of a sudden it triggers something in his mind. It triggers that an event is getting ready to happen. The hour has come when the Son of Man is to be glorified. Now you may remember other stories in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, it's not my hour. This is not my time. But now is the time. And then he begins to talk about a kernel of wheat falling and dying so that other plants, if you will, might grow from it. Then he gives this interesting comparison. He shifts from talking about seeds to humans, if you will. If anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. And then this, whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. Whoever serves me must follow me. I don't know what they were thinking at the time, but if a religious scholar, one who was really educated in the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, if they remembered that through Moses, after God had just brought them out of Egypt, just brought them out of slavery, he said to them, you will be my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests. And priests do what? They serve the people. So it shouldn't have surprised people with such knowledge for him to say, whoever serves me must follow me. Unless, of course, you didn't realize that Jesus was, in fact, the Son of God, and he was talking about following and serving the true God. But again, it's interesting in the context to think of what they were expecting in a Messiah. And Jesus says, whoever serves me must follow me. Where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. The disciples, at least Philip and Andrew, were present. They were hearing this. Perhaps the others were, or perhaps they all heard when they began to spread this word around. But I bring it back to our calling because apparently what Jesus intends, and as he goes on, in the next few chapters, the next one in particular, he talks very seriously to his disciples about the fact that he came to wash their feet. And he expects them to do the same. You remember Peter's reaction?
No.
Not a chance, Lord. You're not going to wash my feet. No way. So even Jesus' own struggled to grasp this idea that he's going to wash their feet. The one who is going to be the Messiah, the liberator, the king, is going to wash my feet. Radical reinterpretation. Now, I want to hold that up to you this morning to go back to what I said early on, how some people misunderstand who God is. Misunderstand not in that they're wrong. He is judge. He is king over all. He has all authority, his son Jesus. But he's often seen as this uncaring judge who is here to make life hard on us, who's here to give us all these rules, who's here to say, well, these are certain people that are mine and you're not. Or perhaps that thought never enters their mind. Perhaps they just simply feel on the outside of God's people. They don't feel welcome in church. Now, I want to take that and hold that out there, those outside the kingdom, but I want to bring it back into us, the church family. I want to bring it back to those of us who are Christian, who claim to be Christian, who understand that God has called us to serve through his son Jesus, and then to push on that a little bit to say that in following him, because remember we're talking about what it means to be a disciple, what is he implying? If you're going to be a disciple, if you're going to follow me to become like me, apparently you've got to be what? A servant. And then in chapter 13, Jesus enacts the word when he begins to wash their feet. Have you ever been to a foot washing? Any of you ever been in a church who washed your feet?
Pastor.
The pastor. Yeah, pretty common. Pretty common meaning for those of us who have gone to a church service where foot washing occurred, or feet washing in this case, and they washed your feet. It was usually the pastor or perhaps a staff pastor. It was a really big church, but it was the pastoral staff. Why? Why would it have been the pastor? Humble. Perhaps to demonstrate, I'm not trying to put words in any pastor's mouth, but perhaps to demonstrate as a pastor, as a church leader, I want to model what my leader did for me. So in this case, if I was washing your feet, I'd want you to know that as the under shepherd of the good shepherd, I'm going to wash your feet. It's an interesting thought to consider because Jesus is instructing his initial disciples to do just that. You flip over to chapter 13, and Jesus says in verse 14, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. And we know those initial disciples became what? Well, a group of them became the apostles. And the apostles became what? The leaders of the early church. So it's natural for us to expect the leaders to wash our feet. But was it limited to the leaders? No. So this idea of whoever serves me, whoever wants to follow me, whoever wants to be my disciple, must be a servant. Now we get that. And those of us who have been walking with the Lord for some time, this is not new news. What I want to ask you to consider this morning is, what place in your life does this have? What place does it have in my life and in your life that I'm called to be a servant? And that in fact, Jesus modeled this. Of all things he could have modeled, he modeled this in the room with his closest disciples, even over the objection of one or more, to then give the critical verse in this passage, verse 15. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you.
That we all have to be servants.
Yeah. That we're all called to be servants. At minimum, servants to each other. But if in fact we're going to represent the one who came to lay down his life, we should be servants of all. Right? So again, I ask you, what place does servanthood have in your life? And I ask that because although I know you know it and I know it, and it's an important part of who we understand Christians to be, I wonder what those on the outside would say if they had to give a report card of our success. I wonder if that's one of the things they would immediately identify if we asked people who are not believers, what is a Christian? I wonder if they would say, oh, they're servants. Well, I don't know, but I know that my neighbor is a servant because he serves me regularly. I don't know what else is involved in following Jesus, but apparently it involves serving, because there's a Christian down the road and she's always serving other people.
I wonder how many people would recognize being a servant as being Christian,
Yeah,
or somebody who just likes to help out, or
right.
whatever.
That's right. Maybe they're just a good person.
Yeah.
That's right. So what might separate the service of a good person versus the service or the servanthood of a follower of Jesus?
Perhaps your attitude while you're doing the survey.
Could be the attitude. This really has nothing to do with what I'm going to tell you, but I found a little interesting play on numbers here. John 13:15. Maybe this will help us remember it. John 13:15 says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. 13:15. If you switch those, John 15:13 says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now that's interesting, because Jesus very clearly has called us to love one another. And at the end of chapter 13, he says, love one another as I've loved you. Right? So now let me ask you again the question. If Jesus has set the example for us, and he says no one has greater love than to lay down their life for their friends, what might be a distinguishing characteristic of our service to others, our way of being a servant, versus just somebody who is a good person? And I'm not trying to knock those people, but I'm saying, is there something different about our service? Real question. Anybody have any thoughts?
spokesperson to explain it. Yeah, God, Jesus was not merely a servant. He taught us everything that the Father have taught him, and usually that's family.
Right. That's
And
right.
you teach generation after generation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he was doing the act of an older brother.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever his father taught him,
He teaches the younger
he
brother,
teaches the younger brothers, and they have to
sisters, and
teach
whoever. That's
the
right.
next.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. What else? If you think about what Jesus did for us in serving and what he's calling us in these passages to do, what's he saying?
I think it needs to be a service of selfless act.
Yeah.
Without God, without Christ, we do things selfishly, whether it is to serve someone else, but for self-satisfaction or feel good about yourself.
Sure.
What Christ is talking about here is doing it because you love the other person. No
Yeah.
glory going back to yourself.
It's the motive.
Right.
It's the motive, and it goes back to the attitude of the heart, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely a key characteristic to this service that he's calling us to do. Is there anything else that strikes you?
In my brain, it's that it is not a foreign concept, that if you read through the scriptures, you read Jesus just does this stuff.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be like him, it should not be second nature to you. It should be first nature.
Right.
You should be looking, I talked about it last week, with a spirit, the heavenly perception or outlook instead of worldly outlook.
Right.
It should just ooze out of you that you serve people without even thinking about it. You just say, yeah, we'll do that.
Sure.
Or let me help, or whatever it is, that it just is a part of your DNA.
That's right. Yeah, if I take all this language and wrap it up into something that would maybe be very familiar to you, we talk in other settings maybe about, doing good works, doing good service. It's important to serve people who are in need. And these are things that, we have programs to do in a church, or maybe you yourself have ways of serving other people where your family maybe goes and serves at a soup kitchen or something of that nature. Nothing wrong with that at all. But when I read it in this context, and I keep in mind that we're to see people differently once we become a part of Jesus' family and a true follower of his, a follower to become like him. Well, then this idea of becoming a servant isn't just something we do, it's who we are. It becomes a part of our identity. And if it's a part of our identity, it's a part of our nature, which is to say it is identifiable. It is so common in who we are and how we are with others. And it is done for the right motive, as Jesus did for us. He gave everything. It is a selfless act. It is a self-sacrificing act. It is truly love with skin on. And that's the language we're familiar with. But I wanted to take us through this exercise this morning because we hear often how it's really difficult to tell who the Christians are anymore. Because Christians seem to be caught up in the same battles and fights everybody else is. We're battling and fighting in politics. We're battling and fighting over the barriers that separate us in life between other people. It's not common that you hear people in the media talk about Christians. Maybe it's not even common that you hear among Christians talk about the fact that it is inherent. It is a part of our identity to be servants. So that doesn't mean just as a program. That means as a person all the time.
That's the way of life.
It's a way of life. Last time I asked you if you were to leave one thing, if you could only leave one thing with your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren, what would that be? And we talked about teaching the Word, because your teaching should reflect the Word as a Christian. And we talked about some of the key passages. You and I both know that they listen to what we say, but they follow what we do.
Acts talk louder than words.
Yeah. I wonder if the thing we might do would be for our children and grandchildren to grow up and be able to say clearly, to be a Christian, to be a follower of Christ, to be one who follows Jesus, to become like him, means that my interests are no longer about my gain. And that's demonstrated through my serving others. Have to be a whole lot of serving for kids to get it as a part, as not just a part of something you did, but it's who you are, right? Over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And some of you are pastors' kids or missionary kids, and you know, over and over and over and over and over. For those watching by video, we're going to celebrate communion. We do this the first Sunday of every month as a rule. And I wanted to highlight this morning this passage of serving as an example Jesus set in a way of living, a way of life, a way of laying down your life for others, as a different way of understanding what communion is all about. So that as we take it, it becomes yet another reminder to us in our comings and goings, day in and day out. Am I recognizable? Am I identifiable as a Christian? Because I'm a servant in the name of Christ. Amen.